The gate hadn't creaked in years. It did now. A single rusted sound split the autumn air as the latch slipped loose, slow and dragging. On the other side of the overgrown orchard, Eleanor turned her head sharply, a half-rotten apple dropping from her hand, her fingers clenched, smeared with brown pulp and memories she didn't want. She stood among wild grass and leaning trees where no one had walked in a decade. The orchard had become a wilderness of grief, branches heavy but unplucked, fruit falling and rotting beneath untended roots. Wind whispered through leaves like a voice she no longer trusted. Her boots made a slow crunch over dry leaves as she stepped toward the fence. A boy stood there, no more than 9, maybe 10. Dirty sneakers, sleeves too short, one knee torn open and crusted with blood. His hair was the color of oak bark, tangled and hanging over eyes that didn't blink. He didn't speak, didn't run, just stood with both hands holding the top of the wooden fence, staring into the heart of the orchard like it had once belonged to him. Eleanor's breath caught, then disappeared into the wind. She hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, months. It didn't matter. The world past her gate had learned to forget her, and she had been glad to be forgotten. "You lost?" she asked, the words scraping against a voice unused. The boy didn't nod, didn't shake his head, just kept staring. Eleanor tightened the shawl around her shoulders, though the sun was warm. "I don't allow people in here." Still no response. Something about him was off. Not fear, not defiance, stillness, a kind of silence that pressed inward, not out, like whatever had happened to him had swallowed his voice whole. She looked around, expecting someone behind him, a frantic parent, a voice calling from the road. There was no one, just the wind. Eleanor stepped closer to the fence. "Do you have a name?" This time he moved. He reached into the pocket of his too-big jacket and pulled out a folded paper. He held it out without meeting her eyes. She took it through the slats of the fence. It was a crumpled school lunch menu with something written in jagged pencil across the back. "I won't go back." Eleanor looked at the words for a long time, then looked at the boy. Something in her rib cage stirred, old, cautious, a pull she didn't want. She handed the paper back without a word. The boy stayed. So did she. And in the space between their silences, the first apple fell that didn't rot alone. The next morning, Eleanor found a half-eaten apple on her porch step. Not near the tree line, not under the orchard's browning branches, but placed deliberately on the first plank of her front steps. A clean bite taken from it, the skin dented just slightly by small fingers. She stared at it as if it might speak. Then she swept it off the step with the end of her broom and turned away. By noon, someone else arrived, but not through the orchard fence. A knock rattled the front door. Not timid, not polite. Eleanor flinched. She hadn't heard that sound in 10 years. She cracked the door open with one hand still holding her broom. On the porch stood a woman in her 30s, all straight lines and pressed khaki hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. In one hand, she held a clipboard. In the other, a phone she didn't bother putting away. "Eleanor Hatch?" the woman asked, eyes flicking up but never quite meeting hers. Eleanor squinted. "Who's asking?" "Miriam Cole, County Youth Services. I'm checking on a reported runaway. Brown hair, 9 years old, missing from a foster home 4 miles west of here." She tapped the clipboard. "Last seen near Route 9. Eleanor's pulse fluttered, but her face stayed cold. "Don't see many kids out this way. You're looking for the school?" "No, ma'am," Miriam said, taking a step closer. "I'm looking for signs of a child hiding where he shouldn't be." Her gaze scanned the porch, the window, the empty swing. She seemed like the type who noticed dust prints, not just footprints. "I've got no one hiding here," Eleanor said, steady. "If a child came through, he didn't stay long." Miriam made a note on the clipboard without responding. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "How'd you get past the gate?" "Walked the main road, saw the mailbox. Figured the orchard's owner might know something. Most people keep fences for dogs. You've got brambles and rust." "It keeps things out," Eleanor said. Miriam nodded once, then finally looked her in the eye. "Or in?" There was something loaded in her tone, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She'd dealt with worse. "I'll be checking again tomorrow," Miriam said, turning crisply on her heel. "We take missing children seriously." As the woman vanished back down the path, Eleanor stood in her doorway, suddenly very aware of the second shadow behind her porch. A small one. Still. Watching. Not a word spoken, but he was there. Not in the house, not even fully on the steps, just near enough to matter. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't scold or beckon. Instead, she said softly into the air between them, "You can't stay forever." The boy didn't answer, just lowered his head and sat cross-legged under the porch rail next to the place where the apple had been. And Eleanor, for the first time in 10 years, left her door unlocked. By the third day, the boy began to rake the leaves. Eleanor hadn't asked. She hadn't even spoken since the social worker's visit. But when she stepped outside that morning, he was already in the orchard, dragging a worn rake through a sea of red and gold. He moved with quiet purpose, like someone who knew work wasn't punishment, but permission to stay. The sight caught her off guard, not because of what he was doing, but because of how natural it looked, like the orchard had been waiting for him. She stood on the porch for a long time, the morning sun turning her shadow long and slender across the grass. Then she went back inside without a word. By midday, he had cleared a wide patch under the oldest tree, the one Eleanor had planted with her husband the year they bought the land. Its trunk was gnarled and split, but still stubbornly green. The boy sat beneath it now, fingers trailing through the loose earth. A small pile of apples, sorted carefully by ripeness, lay beside him. Eleanor watched through the kitchen window, trying to ignore the way her chest tightened. That night, as she closed the back door, she saw something unusual near the fence. A box, cardboard, dry, carefully placed. Inside were three things: a cracked flashlight, a half-filled journal with childish drawings, and a Ziploc bag with two sandwiches, peanut butter and honey. No clothes, no name, but it was a home of sorts. She looked up toward the porch, where the boy had made his usual place beneath the steps. "You've been here before," she said, the words tasting like question, but shaped like truth. The boy didn't nod, but he didn't flinch either. Eleanor crouched beside the box. The journal was water-damaged, pages soft and curled. The drawings were odd trees, many trees, some marked with red X's, others with stars, and in one corner a stick figure with an apple in each hand. She closed it carefully. In the kitchen that evening, she made 2 bowls of soup instead of one. She set one on the back steps, then sat with hers inside the door. The boy came and took the bowl without a glance. He didn't eat quickly, like a starved child. He ate carefully, with small bites, as if the warmth needed time to reach him. When he was done, he left the bowl exactly where it had been, washed clean with water from the garden spigot. Eleanor watched the stars rise behind the orchard's black branches and whispered to herself, "He's not running, he's returning." And for the first time in years, the trees didn't seem so heavy. 3 days later, the town finally noticed. Eleanor only went into town when she had to gas, flour, and the occasional book left on a library shelf no one touched. She drove the truck her husband had left behind, a square old thing that coughed more than it purred. She'd just filled the tank when a voice stopped her mid-swipe. "You still out at the orchard, Eleanor?" She turned. The man behind the question wore a blue uniform shirt with a stitched name tag. Cal. He was the gas station owner, maybe in his 60s now, thinner than he used to be, but still nosy. "Haven't moved," she said. "Same place I've been." He squinted toward her windshield, then leaned a little closer. "You got company?" She tensed. "What makes you ask?" Cal shrugged. "Kid was seen walking the shoulder past Route 17 a few nights back. Quiet one. Brown hair. Sheriff drove out to check old barns. I said you don't get visitors, but—" He let the words hang. Eleanor didn't answer. Didn't need to. Cal studied her face for a long moment, then said quietly, "If he's yours, Ellie, better get ahead of it. County folks don't knock twice these days." She handed him the cash and climbed into the truck without a word. But all the way home, the road seemed louder than usual. When she turned onto her dirt path, the orchard was golden in the afternoon sun, and at the fence, with his back to her, the boy was building something, stacking apple crates into a crooked tower, balanced with string and rocks. It looked absurd, fragile. But then she saw what it was meant to be, a lookout, facing outward toward the road. He knew someone was coming. Inside, Eleanor slammed the door harder than she meant to. She hated how quickly she'd become protective, how easily his silence had filled the space where sorrow used to live. That night, after he fell asleep on the back porch, curled up with his box of things, she pulled an old blanket from the linen chest and laid it over him. She turned to go. Eleanor. She froze. The voice was soft, rusted from disuse, but clear. She turned back, heart stuttering. The boy was looking at her, wide-eyed, almost afraid of what he'd done, like speaking had broken something he couldn't fix. Her throat tightened. "You know my name." He nodded, just once. And in that nod, something old and locked away shifted in her, like a door easing open, just enough to let breath through. She didn't ask how. Not yet. But she would. The next morning, Eleanor found a basket on her porch. Wicker, worn, stuffed full of late-season tomatoes, still warm from the sun. There was no note, just the soft scent of basil tucked in between the fruit and a scrap of gingham cloth folded neatly over the top. Eleanor stared at it, then sighed and looked down the hill. At the bottom of the orchard, near the bend in the road, stood the white cottage of Mrs. Dorsey, a retired nurse who had once stitched Eleanor's palm after a cider press accident, and who had long since traded bandages for backyard gardening and gossip. Eleanor walked the path slowly, each footstep stirring fallen leaves. When she reached the small gate, Mrs. Dorsey was waiting hands on hips, apron dusted with flour, and a look like she'd been expecting her. "I don't recall asking for tomatoes," Eleanor said. "You didn't," Mrs. Dorsey replied, brushing her hands clean on a towel. "But word travels, and when it does, I don't wait for an invitation." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "You heard." "About the boy? Everyone's heard, but no one knows anything. Just sightings and half-whispers. I figured food talks better than I do." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. "He doesn't eat tomatoes." "Then you do. You're thin as a rail, and no one survives grief and autumn, both without something warm in their belly." Mrs. Dorsey's voice softened. "Does he talk?" Eleanor hesitated. "Once." Mrs. Dorsey didn't push. Instead, she stepped aside. "Come in. I have tea steeping and too much dough rising." Inside the cottage, the air smelled like nutmeg and old quilts. Eleanor sat stiffly, hands in her lap, while Mrs. Dorsey poured from a blue kettle and hummed to herself. "I knew a boy like him," the older woman said finally. "Long time ago. Foster homes, runaways. They carry silence like armor, and sometimes it fits too well." Eleanor looked at her, startled. "He's not just hiding. He belongs." Mrs. Dorsey smiled sadly. "That's the most dangerous kind of child, the one who finds a place too dear to lose." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly around her cup. Before she left, Mrs. Dorsey pressed a jar of apple preserves into her palm. "For when it gets colder, he'll need sweet things." Eleanor walked back slowly, the warmth of the tea still in her chest. When she reached the orchard, the boy was standing near the tree with the stars carved into its bark, a tree that hadn't borne fruit in years. Now, one green apple hung from its highest branch. The boy pointed. She followed his gaze. And for the first time in over a decade, Eleanor smiled. The knock came just before dusk. 3 firm raps, then silence. Eleanor didn't need to look through the curtain. She knew it would be Miriam Cole, clipboard ready, lips pressed in that professional line. The wind carried her scent ahead of her paper car air freshener, a faint trace of office soap. She opened the door slowly. Miriam stood with one foot on the porch step, pen in hand. "Evening," she said, tone clipped. "Still no sign of the boy?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. "Haven't seen anyone unusual." Miriam raised an eyebrow. "That so?" "Because the county got another tip. Someone said they saw a child near the orchard fence. Again." Eleanor leaned on the door frame. "People see all kinds of things when they don't mind their own." Behind her, the house smelled of apples baking. She had made pie for the first time in 10 years. A small one. She hadn't even noticed doing it. Her hands had moved on memory alone. Miriam took a breath. "If the boy is here and you're not reporting him, that becomes obstruction. I don't want to take this further." Eleanor's voice was calm. "There's no one living in my home but me." "But what about your land?" A pause. Eleanor held her gaze. "I'd like you to leave now." Miriam looked past her, scanning the edges of the porch, the corners of the windows. Eleanor's heart thudded once, then again. She fought the urge to glance toward the back steps. Finally, the social worker sighed. "We'll be in touch. If he shows up, if he's in danger, you need to do the right thing." She walked away with the quiet confidence of someone who wasn't done. Eleanor closed the door. She turned and found the boy already inside. Not hiding. Standing at the edge of the kitchen, hands clasped together, his gaze not on her, but on the pie cooling near the window. He looked unsure not about being inside, but about whether he should be. She crossed to the counter and sliced it gently. No words, just the sound of the knife on ceramic and the soft crumble of crust. She set a plate on the table. He sat. This time he ate with both hands. When he finished, he whispered, "She'll come back." Eleanor nodded. "I know." He hesitated. "I'll go." But she reached across the table and touched his wrist. "No," she said, "we find the answers here." And through the kitchen window, the orchard breathed quietly in the dusk. The next morning brought frost. Not enough to kill, just enough to whisper that time was moving forward, and not kindly. Eleanor wrapped herself in a wool coat she hadn't touched since the funeral. It still smelled of cedar and attic dust. The boy waited at the edge of the orchard, near the same tree with stars carved deep in its bark, his lookout post. But today, he wasn't building anything. He was sitting on the ground, digging gently at the roots with a flat stone, his fingers careful not to damage them. The earth was soft from last night's rain, darker than it had been in months. She watched him for a while before stepping closer. "You always go to this tree?" she said softly. He nodded. "Why?" He didn't look at her, just touched one of the stars carved into the trunk, then reached into his jacket and pulled out the journal again, the one she'd seen in his box. He flipped to a page near the middle and handed it to her. It wasn't a drawing. It was a list. Names, dozens of them, each scratched in messy pencil, some crossed out, others underlined. She read them slowly, then paused at the bottom. Thomas written 3 times. Circle around it. She looked at him. "Is that you?" He shrugged, but his eyes gave it away. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think it is." He pointed again to the tree. "I don't know who planted it." Eleanor looked up at the trunk. It was the only tree in the orchard without a brass tag. The rest had been marked by her husband, back when he believed everything needed a name to be remembered. This one, older, gnarled, bent just slightly east, stood unclaimed. "You can name it," she said. Thomas looked at her with uncertainty. "Go on." He hesitated, then whispered, "Hope." Eleanor swallowed hard. Something tightened in her throat. Not pain, not grief. Something returning. That evening, she found an old tag in the barn, blank. She polished it, wrote the word herself in deep ink, and nailed it gently into the tree's bark. Hope. When Thomas saw it, he smiled. Not fully, but enough to shift the sky. The wind changed the next day, stronger, colder. The orchard hummed with it, branches clicking against each other like old bones settling. Eleanor stood at the kitchen sink, watching Thomas through the glass. He was tying bits of twine between trees, small flags made from cloth scraps fluttering between them. Each one was placed with intention, not random, a map of something. Only he understood. The knock came just before noon, not at the front. At the side gate, the one rusted shut for years. Eleanor stepped outside, the wind tugging at her sleeves. A man stood there, wrapped in a knitted red scarf that clashed with the dark suit beneath. His beard was trimmed, shoes muddy, eyes sharp and gray. He held a photo in his gloved hand. "I'm looking for a boy," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "Brown hair, about this tall. His name's Thomas." Eleanor didn't speak. She looked at the photo. It was Thomas Younger, smiling faintly beside a woman with kind eyes and a hospital badge. The corner of the photo was torn, but enough remained. "I'm not with the county," the man said quickly. "I used to be his teacher. I was close with his mother. She passed last winter. I've been trying to find him ever since." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the gate. "He disappeared from the system, was placed wrong, then ran. No one followed the paperwork." He looked up at her. "But I did." She didn't answer right away. "He's safe here," she said finally. "He hasn't spoken more than a few words, but he works, helps, listens." The man's shoulders dropped slightly. "That sounds like him." From the orchard came the soft crunch of footsteps, Thomas emerging from the trees, twine still in hand. He saw the man, stopped cold. "Oh!" The scarf, the photo, recognition, but not warmth, just distance. Eleanor glanced at the boy. "You know him?" Thomas nodded, barely. The man stepped forward slowly. "I'm Jonah. You remember me?" Thomas didn't speak, but he didn't run either. Jonah knelt. "I've been looking for you, buddy. Your mom asked me to. I promised her." A long pause. Then Thomas, voice quiet as wind through bare limbs, said, "She liked apples." Jonah smiled. "She did. Used to make those sticky pies that glued your teeth together." Thomas's mouth twitched. almost a smile. Eleanor stepped back, giving them space. But even as she did, a weight settled in her chest, soft but sharp. He had someone else. And maybe he wouldn't stay. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, wrapped in the same old shawl, watching the orchard flicker under the moonlight. Thomas had gone to bed early, quieter than usual, his dinner half-eaten, his eyes unreadable. Jonah had sat up in the guest room at Eleanor's insistence, though he had protested, said he'd sleep in his car. She wouldn't hear of it. But now the house felt too full, too temporary. She stood, walked to the back porch, and pulled on her boots. The barn creaked like it always did, soft as a sigh. Dust curled in the corners, and the air smelled of old wood, rust, and something faintly sweet. She climbed the ladder to the loft. The blanket was still there, tucked into the far corner, blue wool, faded and worn, the one she'd wrapped around her daughter the last time she was sick, the one no one had touched since. Eleanor sat beside it and ran her hand over the frayed edge. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years, not when her daughter died, not when her husband left in silence, shattered by grief, not when the orchard turned wild. But tonight, with the wind rattling the rafters, something broke loose, quiet, steady. And then she heard it, not the wind. Footsteps. She wiped her face and turned. Thomas stood at the top of the ladder, barefoot, clutching his flashlight, not afraid, just there, like he knew exactly where she would be. He crossed the loft without speaking and sat beside her. For a long time they said nothing, just watched the dust swirl in the beam of his light. Then Eleanor whispered, "He wants to take you." Thomas didn't move. "He's kind. He'll protect you. You'd be safe." Still no answer. "But," her voice caught, "I'm not ready." Thomas looked at her, really looked, then reached out and covered her hand with his own. "I'm not either," he whispered. They sat like that until the cold reached their skin. Downstairs, the kettle began to whistle, Jonah waking early. The orchard waited outside, heavy with frost. And for now, Thomas was still home. The wind woke her. Sometime past midnight, the sky had turned black with anger. Thunder rolled across the hills like a warning. Eleanor moved through the house, lighting candles, her steps familiar, rehearsed. She knew how to ride out storms. But when she opened the back door to check the latch on the barn, she saw it immediately. The lookout tower Thomas had built from crates had collapsed. Twine hung like seaweed from broken branches. One of the little cloth flags fluttered at her feet. She stepped out barefoot, rain soaking her shawl in seconds. By the time she reached the orchard's edge, she saw him. Thomas, standing in the mud, arms wrapped around the trunk of the hope tree as if anchoring himself to it. "Thomas!" she called, voice swallowed by wind. He didn't move. She rushed forward, her coat dragging behind her, and wrapped her arms around him from behind. "You'll freeze!" she shouted near his ear. "Come inside!" But he just shook his head, pressing one hand to the tree bark, his fingers tracing the stars he had once touched in silence. Then she saw something, a carving, new, crude, still wet from the knife. Not a name this time, a symbol. Two apples, side by side, a line drawn between them. Connection. I wanted to stay, Thomas said, barely audible through the wind. I know, Eleanor whispered, holding tighter. Lightning cracked across the sky, revealing Jonah's figure running toward them from the house, jacket half-zipped, shoes sinking into the mud. He reached them, panting. "You all right?" he shouted. Eleanor nodded, pulling Thomas closer. Jonah dropped to his knees. "We need to get him inside." But Eleanor shook her head. Not yet. She reached up and tore the last flag from the fallen tower, held it in both hands, then knotted it to the branch above Thomas's head. A new banner, a new beginning. The storm thundered around them, wild and uncaring. But beneath that tree in the rain, 3 people stood like roots, buried deep, cold, soaked, and together. And somewhere between the thunder and the wind, stars broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. The sun returned as if nothing had happened. The orchard shimmered with dew, branches bending gently under the weight of the storm's aftermath. Leaves lay scattered like notes on the earth, and the mud bore footprints. 3 pairs now. Eleanor found the jar on the porch rail. An old mason jar, the kind her mother used for peach preserves. Inside was a piece of folded paper, slightly damp at the edges. No name, no signature. She opened it slowly. "To whoever finds him." He doesn't speak, but he listens. He remembers everything, even if he doesn't say it. "Please let him stay where things grow." Eleanor's breath hitched. She looked out toward the orchard. Jonah and Thomas were planting something at the base of the hope tree. Small shoots, maybe beans, maybe wildflowers. Eleanor didn't ask. She just watched. Jonah was patient. He let Thomas lead, showing him how deep to place the root, how much soil to press down. At one point, Thomas placed a hand on Jonah's wrist and left it there longer than needed. Jonah didn't flinch. He just smiled. Later, as the sun stretched higher, Jonah packed a bag, folded shirts, wrote a note for his job back in the city. He stood near the porch steps, unsure. "I don't want to take him from here," he said quietly, "but I'll stay nearby, if that's allowed." Eleanor looked at him, eyes tired but warm. "He's not mine, Jonah, not like that. But he's part of this place now." Jonah nodded. "Then maybe I can be too." That afternoon, Eleanor took the jar and buried it beneath the hope tree. No ceremony, just the sound of the shovel in the dirt, and Thomas watching silently, arms folded. The wind stirred once, gently, as if someone had agreed. And inside the house, 3 chairs sat at the kitchen table. One more than yesterday, and enough for tomorrow. The apples came early that year. Eleanor noticed at first in the blush of color on the eastern trees a kind of stubborn ripening that hadn't happened in a decade. The orchard, long left to rot, now burst with fruit that clung strong and full. Even the tree named Hope bore 4 green apples, firm and round like tiny lanterns in the branches. She didn't say anything about it, but Jonah did. "You think it's because of him?" he asked one morning, nodding toward Thomas, who was balancing a basket on his head and walking between rows with theatrical caution. Eleanor glanced up from her pruning. "I think the trees were just waiting." Thomas caught her eye and grinned an actual grin, wide and lopsided. Then he slipped, dropped the basket, and sent apples rolling in every direction. He shouted something, just one word, and both adults turned in surprise. "Oops!" They stared, then burst into laughter. It was the first time his voice rang through the orchard, not in a whisper or a tremble, but bright and careless, like a boy. Jonah clutched his chest, mock fainting. "I'll mark the calendar." Eleanor tossed him an apple. "Frame the moment." That afternoon they picked together. Not for sale, not for cider, just because the trees gave, and they were there to receive. Mrs. Dorsey came by with more jars and helped peel. Her laugh filled the kitchen as she recounted a story about a pie disaster from the 90s. And Thomas, eyes wide, listened like it was a sacred tale. Later, he drew it in his journal, a cartoon of a pie exploding in the oven. Mrs. Dorsey flying backward with her hair on fire. She laughed so hard she had to sit down. By evening, the house smelled of sugar and cinnamon and something deeper, belonging. Eleanor stood in the doorway, apron dusted with flour, watching them all. Jonah leaning against the wall with a tea towel. Thomas curled up with the dog from next door who had adopted them sometime during the storm. And Mrs. Dorsey humming off-key as she set out plates. The orchard glowed outside. And for the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like a woman keeping people out. She felt like someone building something worth keeping in. October came with gold. Leaves blanketed the orchard paths, and Thomas took to arranging them into careful spirals near the fence, a pattern only he seemed to understand. Eleanor didn't ask what they meant. She'd learned by now that some things bloom only in silence. One afternoon, Jonah brought home a wooden sign, rough-cut, hand-lettered. "No one picks apples alone." He nailed it beside the front gate, just below the old rusted latch that had once warned the world to stay away. Thomas watched quietly, then went to the porch, brought back a small apple from the kitchen bowl, and laid it beneath the sign like an offering. No one moved for a long time. That evening, a car pulled up. Not Miriam, not a stranger. A woman in her 60s stepped out, slender, pale, dressed in a coat too fine for the dirt path, but her hands trembled and her eyes searched the property like someone chasing memory. Eleanor stepped outside, cautious. "I'm sorry to intrude," the woman said softly. "I used to live here a long time ago, when it was still cared for." Eleanor blinked. "This land's been in my family 50 years. The woman smiled gently. "It wasn't mine, not officially. My sister worked the kitchen. I was only here one summer. But I remember the apples. They were sweet, even off the branch." Eleanor stepped aside. "You're welcome to walk." As the woman wandered the orchard, touching the trees like old friends, Thomas stayed near the hope tree, carving another small mark into the wood, this one shaped like a heart. Beneath it, he etched a tiny ladder. Later, Eleanor asked, "Why the ladder?" Thomas shrugged. "To reach the ones we can't pick alone." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, warm and steady. Some apples they would never reach again. But others, new ones, golden and high, were growing, and they were ready. Winter came soft that year. Snow drifted in slow, delicate flakes across the orchard, clinging to branches that had once broken under silence. Now the trees stood tall, not tamed, but loved, the kind of love that doesn't prune too harshly, that lets things grow wild where they must. Inside the house, the fire crackled low. Mrs. Dorsey knitted at the kitchen table, humming the same three-note tune she always forgot the words to. Jonah sipped coffee by the window, notebook in his lap, half filled with plans for a shed they might build come spring. And Thomas, he was outside, bundled in a too large coat, arms lifted as snowflakes caught in his hair. He spun once, then fell back into the snow with a laugh that echoed all the way to the tree line. Eleanor stood on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, watching him, not guarding, not waiting, just present. She thought of the jar beneath the hope tree, and the hands that had written that letter, desperate, brave, asking only for a chance. She thought of Thomas's silence, of the apples they'd left on the ground for years, and how none of it had rotted, not really. It had all just been waiting, waiting for someone to stay. That spring, they planted a new tree in the center of the orchard. Thomas picked the spot. Jonah dug the hole. Eleanor pressed the roots into the earth with bare hands. There was no plaque, no ceremony, just a small ribbon tied around the trunk. And when the first bud appeared weeks later, pale and green and trembling in the wind, Thomas turned to Eleanor and asked, "Do you think it remembers?" She looked up, eyes full and steady. "Maybe," she said, "but I think what matters most is that we do." And as the wind moved through the branches, carrying the scent of old blossoms and new beginnings, the orchard stood full, not of apples alone, but of people. And no one ever again picked them alone. What part of this story touched you the most? Do you believe people like trees can bloom again, no matter how long they've been bare? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. The orchard stood full, not of apples alone, but of people. And no one ever again picked them alone. What part of this story touched you the most? Do you believe people like trees can bloom again, no matter how long they've been bare? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one.